At exactly 7:04 a.m. Lagos time, a Nigerian businessman slammed his fist on a glass desk. $2 million of his frozen, not by fraud, not by any crime, but by a faceless algorithm in New York that flagged his transaction as suspicious. All he wanted was to buy coffee beans from Kenya. All he needed was for his money to move. But it didn't. It stalled for 3 days. His workers' salaries hung in limbo. His contracts risked collapse. And worst of all, he had seen this before. 30 years ago, his father had stared helplessly at a faxed message from a Western bank, refusing to process a $50,000 transfer for emergency medical supplies. Back then they called it bureaucracy. Today they call it compliance, but for him it felt like control, the same leash, just with a different name. And here's the part that will make your blood boil: over 80% of financial transactions between African nations still pass through the United States or Europe. Let that sink in. To move money from Nigeria to Kenya, you must first go through New York. To buy cocoa in Ghana, you need clearance from London. To do business with your neighbor, you need permission from strangers across an ocean. Why does African money need permission from New York? It's not just a question, it's a wound. It's humiliation with a transaction fee. But what if? Someone said enough. What if 12 men met in secret to end this silent war? No media, no press release. Just one goal: break the chains digitally. You're about to hear a story that never made headlines. A quiet revolution born from silence, built in shadows, and now ready to shatter the rules of global finance. And it begins, not with a gunshot, but with a line of code. Have you ever felt your heart shatter from sheer frustration? When you see your homeland, our Africa, bled dry of its wealth, while its children huddle hungry in broken homes without food or clothing. We have endured enough. Now is the time for us, the sons and daughters of the continent, to join hands, rise together, and shout to the world. We have the right to live. We have the right to grow. We have the right to be respected. Share this video. Not just to tell a story, but to let our voice echo. Let God see the courage in our hearts. Let the world stop turning away from the starving children of Africa, from the silent tears of our mothers. Share not just for a video, but for a dream of free Africa. The one that began with a frozen transaction didn't end there. It triggered a chain reaction. Across the continent in Kigali, Rwanda, something extraordinary was unfolding. Quietly, privately, and dangerously. Inside the basement of an unmarked hotel, 12 men gathered in silence. They weren't activists. They weren't rebels. They were the governors of 12 African central banks. No media, no speeches, no national anthems, just tension thick enough to cut through. They weren't there to discuss interest rates or inflation targets. They were there to confront a painful truth. We live under a system where a man in New York can freeze the economy of an entire African nation with a single click. It wasn't an exaggeration, it was a diagnosis. In the past decade alone, over 240 intra-African transactions were blocked or delayed not by African regulations, but by Western risk algorithms. Cocoa from Ghana to Ivory Coast, medical equipment from Egypt to Ethiopia, all routed through Switzerland or Frankfurt. Even life-saving funds were stalled, not because they were unsafe, but because they were African. And here was the bitter paradox: the richer the continent in resources, the poorer it was in sovereignty. The men in that room had all felt it. The sting of being reduced to a red flag on someone else's screen. And then someone finally asked what no one had dared say aloud. If they have Swift, why can't we have Ubuntu, not just a name? A declaration. Ubuntu. I am because we are. A philosophy, a rebellion, a blueprint. Their goal: build an African digital bank, a new payment system, not pegged to the dollar, not routed through Europe, completely independent. No more permissions, no more detours, no more humiliation. But they knew the risks. If word got out, Western lenders could cut them off. Credit ratings could be slashed overnight. Political friends with foreign bank accounts could turn into enemies. The IMF might start knocking, not with aid, but with pressure. "We don't need to reclaim power," one said. "We need to build it ourselves." So they made a choice: no announcements, no declarations, only action. Ubuntu would start in the shadows, and it would be built line by line in silence. No one left that room with documents, only with conviction. The next day, a secure email was sent to 3 software engineers in Nairobi. Its message: we need a new financial infrastructure. Independent. Encrypted. African. No slogans. No revolution posters. Just one goal: to free a continent not with riots, but with code. What followed would be months of secrecy-defiant sabotage and survival, a digital rebellion hidden in plain sight. And it all began in that basement with 12 men who said enough. They called it Ubuntu, but it wasn't just a name. It was an act of rebellion, a line in the sand drawn with code. No press release, no budget announcement, no grand unveil. Just a whispered start. Start building, no one can know. For the first 6 months, Ubuntu existed only in encrypted messages and midnight Zoom calls. A digital fortress under construction designed to free a continent from financial captivity. The team behind it: young, brilliant, and invisible. A 26-year-old cryptography expert from Nairobi who used to work for a Western bank. A data security analyst from Lagos who refused a job offer from Silicon Valley. A full-stack architect from Cape Town who never wrote a single line under his real name. They weren't rebels. They were architects of silent revolution. Their mission: build a payment system that allowed African nations to trade in their own currencies, bypassing the US dollar, ignoring SWIFT, and shielding themselves from surveillance. It started small: a digital transaction ledger, hosted across 2 mirrored servers, one buried inside a government archive in Addis Ababa, the other cloaked inside a power grid node in Cape Town. No cloud, no Amazon Web Services, no Google dependencies. They couldn't afford to be watched. Everything had to be local, decentralized, encrypted, fail-safe, and most importantly, untraceable until ready. But the world wasn't going to stand still while they built it. Barely a month into development, the Cape Town server was hit with a brute force cyber attack, nearly 9,000 intrusion attempts in under 48 hours. Then Addis Ababa followed. Patterns suggested the attackers were using AI-driven tools not typically accessible to private individuals. Someone was watching. 2 weeks later, an anonymous package arrived at the doorstep of the Nairobi developer's home. Inside, a black USB stick, blank except for one text file. "We know what you're building. Stop before you lose everything. Africa is not ready." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. And yet they didn't stop. The Ubuntu team doubled down, moved operations into a disused university server room in Lusaka. No Wi-Fi, no online backups. Only air-gapped drives and encrypted code printed on paper. They changed emails weekly, used burner phones, wore gloves when handling documents. One developer even rotated between 3 SIM cards, each registered under a different fake ID. Still, the pressure mounted. Banks quietly began issuing warnings to employees. If you are approached to work on any unsanctioned digital infrastructure, report immediately. An African finance minister was abruptly reassigned after being seen in Kigali a week too early. 2 engineers in Accra were offered suspiciously generous consulting contracts from Western firms on the condition they cut all ties with experimental African platforms. One accepted, the other disappeared. The project was now a race not against time, but against betrayal. But progress came. By month 4, Ubuntu could successfully complete simulated transactions in 4 African currencies between sandbox nodes in Rwanda, Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria. By month 5, the latency was reduced to 22 seconds. By month 6, the first real transaction was executed in secret between Ghana and Nigeria. 150,000 cites for a fuel contract cleared in 29 seconds. No dollar, no SWIFT, no middlemen. The developers watched in silence as the screen blinked. Success. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone whispered, "That's what freedom feels like." But the threat level rose just as fast. The same week, a leaked memo from a major international bank circulated internally. "We have detected unauthorized cross-border settlements bypassing existing financial systems. All personnel are to monitor transactions from sub-Saharan Africa for anomalies." The walls were closing in. A journalist from London reached out, asking questions too precise to be coincidence. 3 major African governments received urgent advisories from their Western donors, cautioning against unsanctioned digital interference. One of Ubuntu's server locations was targeted by a drone surveillance sweep. The developers knew the time for secrecy was running out. But they also knew this Ubuntu worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and real was all they needed. They burned paper logs, shut down test nodes, migrated the servers again, this time to a disguised server in an agricultural research facility in Malawi, and then they waited for the right moment to launch, because once it was live, there would be no turning back. They built it in darkness, not because they feared the light, but because the light had never been safe for them. They knew the world would call them radicals. They knew governments would panic. They knew banks would retaliate. They knew old allies might suddenly become threats. But they also knew this: no chain is ever broken in comfort. No freedom is ever granted. It must be taken. And Ubuntu, born from shadows, was ready to face the sun. It happened at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. There was no countdown, no media, no celebration, just a group of engineers huddled in a dark server room in Lusaka, staring at a terminal screen. On one end, Ghana's National Petroleum Corporation. On the other, Nigeria's state-owned oil distributor. Transaction value 150,000 cedis. Purpose fuel shipment, Port of Tema to Port Harcourt. Time allowed 60 seconds. Currency no dollars, no euros, no intermediary, just African money. On an African network, built by African hands. They hit enter, and for nearly half a minute no one breathed. The screen blinked, lines of code scrolled. Transaction approved, settlement complete, 29.8. For a moment the room was silent. Then someone whispered, "It worked." Another voice, "They didn't see it." Another, "We just bought oil." Without New York. And then came the tears. Not of joy, not yet, but of something deeper, something older, relief. For the first time in modern African history, 2 nations had traded without foreign permission. But elsewhere the silence didn't last. At a global transaction monitoring hub in Zurich, a data analyst flagged an anomaly. 2 large institutions had just transferred funds directly outside of the SWIFT network with no Western bank in between. It triggered an internal alert. In London, a senior compliance officer at a major bank stared at the data confused. No routing data, no intermediary. What the hell is Ubuntu TXN 00A-GHNG? She sent it to her supervisor. Within an hour, it was on a desk at the IMF. By nightfall, the whispers had begun. What is Ubuntu? Is it a government project? Is this sanctioned? Who authorized this? No one had answers, and that terrified them. By the next morning, a confidential cable had been sent from Washington to multiple embassies across Africa. The subject line, "Urgent Investigation of Rogue Payment Network in West Africa." Terms like financial destabilization and unregulated system risk began appearing in internal memos. But they weren't just worried about the technology. They were terrified of the idea. If Ubuntu worked, others would follow. Already, unofficial reports hinted that 3 other countries, Rwanda, Kenya, and Senegal, had requested test access. Quietly, off the record. Meanwhile, in Africa, the reaction was something entirely different. The Ghanaian finance minister received a report the next day. Funds received in full. Latency 29 seconds. No errors. He simply stared at the paper. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, almost to himself, "So this is what sovereignty feels like." He called no press conference. He didn't tweet. But the next day he delayed a meeting with the IMF. No explanation, just postponed. The Nigerian counterpart. He quietly shifted a portion of his ministry's reserve from dollars to naira. An internal note. "We may not need as much FX buffer going forward." The shockwave had begun. Not because the amount was massive, not because the transaction was public, but because it was impossible. And it happened anyway. The West reacted fast. IMF directors convened an emergency virtual session. The World Bank's Africa desk issued a strategic advisory to partner nations exercise caution in engaging with non-compliant digital finance systems. Such platforms may compromise international credibility. Translated, don't play with fire. But the tone wasn't confident. It was anxious. Because they couldn't trace the architecture. They couldn't see the ledger. And worst of all, they couldn't stop it. For decades, Africa's financial nervous system had been external. Now, someone had just rewired it. Inside the Ubuntu team, the mood shifted. The successful transaction had opened a door they could no longer close. Requests began pouring in from within the continent. Could it handle remittances? Could it connect microloans? Could it be open-sourced? They weren't ready. But neither was the world. They moved fast, reinforced encryption layers, built region-specific nodes, developed rollback protocols in case of systemic failure. They even began mapping the continent node by node, designing a decentralized web of trust that spanned from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. This wasn't just a platform anymore. It was infrastructure. It was strategy. It was defiance made digital. And yet they remained silent. There were no billboards, no official announcements, no Africa Spring headlines. They let the system speak for itself, transaction by transaction, second by second, because they knew something the West was only beginning to realize. A system that empowers a continent doesn't need permission. It needs to work. It needs to survive. It needs to scale. And now the seed had been planted. The day after the transaction in a quiet village in central Kenya, a coffee cooperative manager received word from Nairobi. Their next export payment would be routed through a new system. He didn't understand the technology. He didn't know about algorithms or decentralization. But he understood this. For the first time, he wouldn't lose 14% in fees. For the first time, payment would arrive before the beans even left the port. For the first time, he would be treated as equal, and that was all he needed. Ubuntu had crossed the line, and there was no going back. They couldn't stop it. By the end of the first week, 5 countries had successfully processed cross-border transactions using Ubuntu. By the end of the first month, that number had jumped to 15. And by the 6th month, 35 African nations were on board. What had begun as a whisper in a Kigali basement had become a continent-wide transformation executed without ceremony, without banners, just results. The effect was immediate and brutal. Transaction time between African nations dropped from 5 to 7 business days to under 30 seconds. Cross-border fees fell by 80%. Trade volume between neighboring countries surged by nearly 200% within the first quarter. For decades, African trade had been stifled not by geography or infrastructure, but by foreign financial choke points, middlemen, who extracted value at every stage of the process. Now the choke points were gone, and so were the middlemen. A logistics firm in Malawi no longer needed to pre-convert its earnings into euros to pay a supplier in Mozambique. A farming cooperative in Ethiopia could sell directly to Rwanda without involving a European correspondent bank. The invisible chains had snapped, and the sound was echoing far beyond Africa. In Washington, silence turned to panic. A classified report prepared by a U.S. Treasury task force was leaked. The Ubuntu protocol represents a structurally independent financial network with geopolitical implications. Continued adoption may significantly reduce USD influence in the sub-Saharan region. Translated, the dollar is losing ground. The report estimated that in just 6 months, Ubuntu had displaced the equivalent of $14 billion in USD-denominated trade within Africa. That may have been a fraction of global volume, but symbolically, it was nuclear. A continent no longer asking permission. The media slow at first caught up. The silent revolution. How Africa is rewriting global finance. Financial Times, a continent untethered. The rise of Ubuntu coin, Bloomberg Swift, who Africa's new economic language. The Economist Western coverage was fascinated, then skeptical, then openly hostile. Think tanks accused Ubuntu of opening the door to money laundering. Lobbyists warned of strategic financial gaps that could be exploited by non-democratic actors. One U.S. senator declared on record, "If Africa disconnects from our system, it will destabilize the world." But it was already too late. Because Ubuntu wasn't an app. It wasn't a single institution, it was a protocol. And protocols don't need passports. Inside Africa, the mood was electric. Entrepreneurs sprang up overnight. Micro-fintech startups offering lightning-fast, cross-border credit remittance apps, slashing costs from 12% to 1.5%. Crowdfunding platforms powered entirely by Ubuntu tokens. A startup founder in Dakar raised $40,000 from contributors in 6 different countries in one day, without a single dollar being involved. A university in Tanzania began issuing tuition invoices in local shillings convertible instantly through Ubuntu. A Pan-African freelance network emerged, allowing creatives in Lusaka to be paid by clients in Accra in their own currency in under 20 seconds. The dream of African integration, so long strangled by foreign dependencies, was breathing again. And yet the threats didn't go away. A Western bank consortium quietly announced it would review its partnerships with any institutions using unverified digital networks. 2 countries under intense diplomatic pressure announced they would pause further exploration of Ubuntu. But for every door that closed, 3 more opened. Because it wasn't centralized. You couldn't shut it down. There was no headquarters, no board of directors, no flag, just code and belief. Even African governments that had previously been skeptical were now leaning in. Kenya proposed linking Ubuntu with its national ID system to create seamless e-citizen payments. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, began informal talks on recognizing Ubuntu as a regional standard. And then came the big move, the announcement of Ubuntu Coin, a stable digital currency pegged not to fiat, but to a basket of real African assets, gold, lithium, cocoa, cobalt, and rare earth minerals. No inflationary manipulation, no printing press, no central reserve across an ocean, just value backed by the soil of the continent. The announcement sent ripples through international markets. The value of select African resource stocks jumped overnight. Speculators scrambled to understand what had just changed. But for Africans, it was simple. They no longer needed to explain. They only needed to keep building. A moment from Malawi summed it up best. A teenager selling hand-woven baskets used Ubuntu Pay via a solar-powered tablet to complete a sale with a tourist from Ghana. When asked if he understood what the system was, he smiled. "It means I don't need to wait 7 days to get paid. It means I can go home now and help my mother." That's all Ubuntu needed to be. Not revolution for the sake of rebellion, but transformation for the sake of dignity. It spread like a virus, but it felt like a heartbeat. And now the world had to listen. The story of Ubuntu is not merely a tale of technological ingenuity or financial innovation. It is a profound lesson in sovereignty resilience and the quiet determination of a continent long underestimated. The very essence of Ubuntu carries lessons that ripple far beyond digital systems or banking reform. It teaches us what it means to reclaim agency in a world built on permissions and gatekeeping. At its core, the Ubuntu initiative reveals the invisible mechanisms that have bound African nations for decades. Despite independence on paper, financial sovereignty remained elusive. Transactions between neighboring countries were routed through distant capitals. Every payment bore the imprint of foreign scrutiny. The delay, the cost, the humiliation all pointed to a deeper truth. Africa was rich in resources but poor in autonomy. From the freezing of funds by algorithms in New York to the subtle threats from Western banks, the message was clear: real independence had not yet arrived. Ubuntu challenged that imbalance head-on. One of the most striking lessons lies in how power responds to defiance. The moment Ubuntu processed its first untraceable transaction, it became a target. Surveillance cyber attacks, diplomatic warnings, even anonymous threats followed swiftly. This demonstrates a timeless principle: true resistance does not go unnoticed. When power structures are threatened even by silent code, written in a hidden basement, the response is swift and aggressive. Yet the developers of Ubuntu, despite the risks, persisted. Their lesson is one of courage, the kind that chooses secrecy not out of fear, but out of strategic necessity. The narrative also teaches us the value of unity forged in silence. The architects of Ubuntu were not public figures or revolutionary icons. They were engineers, analysts, thinkers, ordinary people, building something extraordinary under extraordinary pressure. They operated without applause, without headlines, and without political support. Their quiet collaboration, their ability to share a dream and guard it fiercely, reflects the kind of continental unity Africa has long aspired to, but struggled to achieve. Ubuntu was unity in action, not in speeches, but in code servers and trust. Another vital lesson is embedded in the phrase that keeps recurring throughout the story. We don't need to reclaim power. We need to build it ourselves. This is the crux of the Ubuntu philosophy. Rather than wait for institutions to change, rather than plead for access or reform, the creators of Ubuntu chose to construct an entirely new system. It's a powerful reminder that asking for permission from those who benefit from your dependence is often a futile pursuit. Real change begins when people stop negotiating for scraps and begin designing their own table. The concept of dignity also runs deep in this story. Whether it was the cooperative farmer in Kenya, the teenage basket seller in Malawi, or the finance ministers who finally felt the weight of sovereignty lift from their shoulders, Ubuntu gave Africans back something intangible yet priceless: dignity in transaction. Not having to explain, not needing approval, not being flagged or delayed, these aren't just technical upgrades. They are emotional and political revolutions. Ubuntu didn't just process payments faster, it validated identities and affirmed equality. Crucially, Ubuntu also forces us to rethink what a revolution looks like in the 21st century. There were no street protests, no uprisings, no dramatic coups. This was not a revolution of fire, but of fiber optics, not of blood, but of bandwidth. It was digital, quiet, and deeply strategic, and yet it shook the foundations of global finance. The lesson here is that not all power needs noise. Sometimes the most transformative actions occur behind closed doors, through small acts, repeated consistently through code deployed without fanfare. The story underscores the profound danger of centralized control, especially when that control is external. When one system, Swift for example, can hold an entire continent hostage, the vulnerability is existential. The Ubuntu team understood that the only antidote to such a threat was decentralization. Their commitment to encryption mirrored servers, local infrastructure, and independence from big tech, reveals a lesson for all societies: control your infrastructure or risk being controlled by others. Sovereignty in the modern world is no longer just about borders, it's about bandwidth protocols and digital resilience. Another key takeaway lies in how ideas spread. Ubuntu did not rely on marketing. It had no advertisements, no billboards, yet it grew. Why? Because it worked. Because it met a real need. And that is a timeless lesson in innovation. If what you build truly serves people, they will adopt it. Trust is not built by slogans, it is built by reliability. Ubuntu proved itself one transaction at a time. This is a model for any grassroots movement: serve, first, speak later. There is also a political lesson, perhaps the most difficult one. Some African governments resisted Ubuntu at first. Some folded under diplomatic pressure. But the ones that embraced it began to see their own potential. The delayed IMF meetings, the reallocation of reserves, the quiet shift in posture. These were not acts of rebellion. They were the first breaths of independence. Ubuntu reminded African leaders that sovereignty isn't something the West grants, it is something Africa must assert. Finally, Ubuntu teaches us that freedom is not a destination, it is a discipline. The fight for financial liberation is not won by a single app or protocol. It must be maintained, updated, defended. The developers understood this. They hardened their systems, rotated their teams, encrypted every message. They didn't assume victory, they prepared for resistance. This is a critical insight for any liberation movement. The moment you succeed is the moment new enemies emerge. In conclusion, the story of Ubuntu is more than a success story. It is a mirror. It reflects the long-standing chains Africa has worn, the silent battles it has fought, and the quiet brilliance it has always possessed. It shows that with enough vision, enough will, and enough code, a continent can shift from asking for permission to setting its own terms. Ubuntu is a blueprint not just for Africa, but for any people seeking to build freedom with their own hands. It teaches us that, in the face of surveillance, sabotage, and suppression, the greatest act of rebellion is to quietly create something that works. And when it works, it changes everything. I watched this video 3 times in a row, and each time I felt the same goosebumps run down my arms. This isn't just a tech story, it's a spiritual awakening. As an African born in the diaspora, I've often felt disconnected from the struggles back home. But this made me feel like something powerful is shifting. Ubuntu gave me hope that Africa is finally taking its future into its own hands. I never realized how deep the financial chains ran until this story showed me. The idea that African countries need permission from New York or London to pay each other is beyond insulting. It's colonialism with better branding. I feel ashamed that I used to accept it as normal. This story opened my eyes. We've been asleep for too long. As a software engineer in Ghana, I was moved to tears. Not because I didn't know what was possible, but because someone finally dared to do it. The developers behind Ubuntu are heroes. They'll never be celebrated on magazine covers, but they deserve statues in every capital city. What they've built is not just a payment system, it's a declaration of war against systemic injustice. There is a line that haunted me. That's what freedom feels like. It's so simple yet so profound. For most of us, freedom has always been abstract, but this story makes it tangible. The moment those funds moved from Ghana to Nigeria without crossing the Atlantic, I felt something shift inside me, like we had just crossed a line we can never uncross. I showed this video to my father, who worked in government finance for over 30 years. He was speechless. He told me we always knew we were being watched, but we never thought we could escape it. To see a generation rise up not with weapons, but with wisdom and code, is beyond anything he imagined. He said it felt like vindication. The part about the Nairobi developer getting that USB threat chilled me. It proves the stakes. We're not just talking about money, we're talking about power, control, and fear. The fear that Africa might finally stand up. The fear that their systems might not be needed anymore. And the response: silent surveillance, sabotage. That tells me everything I need to know. I run a small import-export business between Tanzania and Rwanda, and for years I've paid ridiculous fees just to convert currencies. I always assumed that's how the system had to work. Now I feel cheated. Ubuntu isn't just about faster transactions, it's about dignity. It's about saying, we're enough. We don't need you to approve our existence. The global reaction to Ubuntu was predictable. Western institutions calling it rogue or unregulated, of course they did. When control slips, they panic. But what struck me was the African silence. No loud declarations, no threats, just success. It's the quiet confidence that terrifies the old order. And it's what gives me hope. I'm from Senegal, and I've always dreamed of seeing a united Africa, not just in words, but in systems. Ubuntu feels like the first real infrastructure of that dream. Pan-Africanism isn't just a slogan anymore. It's code, it's currency, it's transactions that say, we trust each other more than we trust outsiders. I read the part about the teenager in Malawi, and I cried. That's what it's all about. Not the politics or the headlines, but the kid who can go home early to help his mom, because he doesn't have to wait a week to get paid. That's the revolution. It's in the everyday lives that suddenly start to feel possible. To those who say Africa isn't ready, I ask, ready for what? Ready to be treated with respect, ready to lead our own future. We've been waiting for centuries. Ubuntu didn't ask for permission. It didn't submit a proposal. It just worked. And that's the greatest act of defiance